Well, hello everyone. It's January the 18th, 2025, and welcome to my podcast, Andy Oakley Investigates. On this podcast, I aim to challenge authority because over the last 50 years or so, we've been conditioned to accept what those in power or authority say. However, one of the successes of the modern West has been the ability of individuals to question that authority. In earlier times, whether in the West or during the age of tribalism, challenging the king or the chief was unthinkable. Everyone was effectively subservient to their ruler. Those days ended in New Zealand when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1840, establishing a centrally governed democracy. And just 60 years later, New Zealand had become more productive per capita than other emerging nations like Australia and the United States. And this progress continued until the 1970s and 1980s. However, since then, we've seen economic regression with wealth increasingly concentrated in fewer hands. We seem to be drifting back to a time when we simply accepted those in authority dictate, which is indeed very dangerous. And from my investigations, it appears that much of what is presented as truth by these figures is actually a narrative constructed to maintain the status quo. And by status quo, I mean the economic conditions that benefit an ever-shrinking group of oligarchs who thrive on keeping countries and their citizens in perpetual debt. So today I'm not only going to challenge what Chris Luxon said about ways to become rich, but also the entire neoclassical economic model, which I believe to be flawed. Recently, New Zealand's Prime Minister, Chris Luxon, stated as he jetted off to the UAE, "We don't get rich selling things to ourselves in New Zealand. We have to trade with the world. That's the way we grow our economy, so you and your family become better off." So this line of thinking by Luxon echoes that of his predecessor, Jacinda Ardern. In fact, I can't recall any recent New Zealand politician who doesn't believe that exporting is the key to wealth. In this case, our largest export sector is agriculture. So today I want to investigate whether this is actually true. Do we genuinely get richer by raising animals on massive farms? Extracting their milk, slaughtering them and sending the food to affluent countries like Dubai and Abu Dhabi? What truly happens to our economy when we become suppliers of goods and service to rich countries like the UAE, which boasts one of the highest GDP per capita in the world? So if it were true that exporting to other countries is the key to economic growth and wealth accumulation for the citizens, why is it that very few people in New Zealand are becoming rich? Moreover, why is our infrastructure deteriorating at the same time to third world standards? All during a period when New Zealand's exports have nearly quadrupled from 14 billion in 2002 to 54 billion in 2022. If I just grab a highlighter, here we see that period. The exports have steadily been with a drop back and they steadily increase all the way up to here, 2022. So let's just think about that year, 2022. And if we look at the rate of growth in annual GDP, we see almost no growth. In fact, our growth rate is slowing, not increasing. So it seems that what Chris Luxon is saying is just not true. Since it was in 2022 that we had our highest rate of exports, that surely, and it was growing over a long period, that surely should correspond to a period when our economy was buzzing and we were getting rich, right?
Is our record high inflation result, our highest in over 30 years. In the middle of a cost of living crisis, inflation hitting 7%, the highest in 30 years, is a real worry for New Zealanders tonight, because the reality is they're worse off than they were 12 months ago. Their money doesn't buy as much as it used to, and as a result they're going backwards under this Labour government. So it's incredibly worrying.
That seems to confirm then that high exports do not improve our economic wealth as a country or make us better off. Rather, it seems to confirm the opposite. The more we export, the worse our economy and our personal wealth get. National's answer to improve the economy and our wealth is to do more exporting and to cut government spending. There appears to be something very wrong with this kind of economic thinking. The more they go down this rabbit hole, the worse things get for us.
But We want to make sure that the savings being saved in areas like health and education are reinvested in the frontline services.
So Luxon believes he can reduce wasteful spending in the health and education sectors within administration areas, and that the savings can be redirected to increase patient care and health and hire more teachers in education. Clearly, Luxon views the funding for core services as being limited by the government's budget allocation. His desire to save money suggests he does not believe additional funds for health and education can be sourced from anywhere else. And given that this government and all previous ones since New Zealand floated its currency in 1985 believe that they fund public services through taxes on people and businesses, and considering the wholesale decline of our economy since then, it indicates that there might be something fundamentally flawed with their economic approach.
New Zealand's financial troubles confirmed today, and things look even worse than we feared. There's no surplus in sight, and the books will stay in the red until at least 2029. And that's only thanks to a bit of accounting trickery that will see ACC's deficit removed from the books. The Finance Minister, Nicola Willis, is with me on the show. Minister, thank you very much for your time. On a scale of 1 to 10, where do you put this? How bad do you put this?
Oh, well, look, this is a tough set of books. There's no question about it. We've seen a downgrade in the forecast assumptions that Treasury were making prior to the election. They were essentially too optimistic before the election. And that has an impact both on the growth rate we're expecting, the revenue we're going to receive, and our path back to getting the books back in balance.
Willis believes that the previous government is to blame for overspending. And now that the extent of the debt is known, it will take the national government many more years to return to a budget surplus than was promised during their campaign. This narrative is a familiar one, often echoed by new governments, not just in New Zealand, but throughout the Western world. The storyline typically unfolds like this. During election cycles, the opposition, regardless of who they are, claims their economic situation is dire due to the mismanagement by the incumbent government, a claim we just heard from Luxon a few moments ago. The opposition nearly always points to excessive spending as the issue because the current government, whoever they may be, typically spends more than it collects in taxes. However, despite this story being widely reported by the media and believed by politicians, by Willis, Luxon and countless others, including economists, it's fundamentally flawed. This narrative must be false because it rests on the misconception that government spending should be limited to tax revenues. Luxon's statement about redirecting existing funds from health and education illustrate this belief, suggesting there is a finite amount of money available. However, this analogy compares government finances to a household budget, which is misleading since New Zealand no longer operates under the gold standards but uses a fiat currency. The New Zealand government, as the sole issuer of the sovereign New Zealand dollar, can create money by simply entering figures into a spreadsheet at the Reserve Bank. And if you doubt this process, consider the testimony of Yong Ha, the Reserve Bank's chief economist, who 4 years ago explained to the nation how the government issued a $50 billion COVID-19 recovery fund.
Just like us creating money as a few keystrokes on an electronic ledger, that suddenly money turns up. When that money gets repaid, it sits on the Reserve Bank's balance sheet, and we just metaphorically destroy it by undoing it with a few keystrokes. So it just works in the reverse.
So the government buys $50 billion of its own bonds with money, which is represented by digits typed into a keyboard at the Reserve Bank, thereby increasing the money in the economy. Again, which is represented by digits on a screen, just in the same way as these digits represent your bank balance. And in the future, when the government hands back the bonds to the Reserve Bank, they simply untype the digits on the spreadsheet. This should be a bloody big clue to economists and politicians that government spending does not rely on collecting taxes. So you might ask, why are they so dumb? Do they really allow us to suffer the anxiousness of not being able to afford to raise a family or pay for the power, or that many of our elderly needlessly die in pain and squalor, just because they are too stupid to realise they've got it all wrong? Well, I think the real reason is a little bit more complicated than that. Firstly, the universities have been captured. Just as they teach fake history these days that causes division, they teach fake economics that causes poverty. And it is this fake education that prevents academics from seeing the bloody obvious. Now, if I use Don Brash as an example because he has a PhD in economics and was the governor of the Reserve Bank from 1988 to 2002, because I know him, I asked him once why New Zealand used to be such a productive country, and from his reign on, when we had become less and less productive. And I was shocked with what he said. He said, "I have no idea, Andy." I also asked him, did he agree with the many economists around the world who are trying to tell governments in the West just what I'm explaining to you now? And he said, no, he didn't agree with it. And you see, he can't, because to do so would destroy his whole career in economics and also everything in his PhD. And this is a massive problem. And I think that only the people can fix it at the ballot box. So you must keep your eye out for political parties that understand this principle and vote them in. And there's another big problem too, bad legislation. And I'm talking about Clause 26G of the Public Finance Act 1989. And it would have been this act that influenced Don Brash way back then and politicians today. And here is that bad legislation, Clause 26G of the Public Finance Act 1989. Principles of responsible fiscal management. As I said at the beginning, people have a tendency to just do or accept what authority says. And actually what this is, it's a bit of legislation that was made up and put in 1989. Of course it could be wrong. Governments are wrong all the time. So let's see what they're saying here. The government, in one, it says the government must pursue its policy objectives in accordance with the following principles, or the principles of responsible fiscal management. In 1A, it states reducing the total debt to prudent levels so as to provide a buffer against factors that may impact adversely on the level of total debt in the future by ensuring that until those levels have been achieved, total operating expenses in each financial year are less than the total operating revenues in the financial year. So what they're doing here is they're imagining that they have rooms full of cash, that the taxes come in cash and they go into a room, and there's no way you can spend more than that cash came into that room because you'll run out of cash. And like a household, if you do that, you'll go broke. That's what they're imagining. But the Reserve Bank doesn't have vaults of cash. The cash is kept in commercial banks. The Reserve Bank operates a spreadsheet. There's no reason to operate like this. They're operating as we used to in the gold standard. So they're using gold standard procedures, but we operate a fiat currency. The currency is not pegged to gold. The government can actually issue currency as it requires. So this is a clue to why we are in such a mess. And if we just go further down here, it says the government may depart from the principles of responsible fiscal management if, well, firstly, practically no Western government is running surplus after surplus. They all spend way more than they take in taxes, and it doesn't seem to have affected them. So you can depart from these if the departure from the principles is temporary, and the minister, in accordance with the Act, states the reasons for the departure from those principles and the approach the government intends to take and how long. This is what Willis was telling the radio host, the reasons for the departure of the approach and the government will take and how long it will take. So this is a clue to why our economy continues to get worse as time goes on. So we have a whole parliament full of politicians and their economic advisors who are operating with gold standard rules in a fiat currency country that has floated its dollar, and they are too stupid to notice it. Either that, or there's some high-level entity deliberately steering our economy to benefit the FIRE sector. And the FIRE sector is finance, insurance, and real estate. This is an ever-growing sector of the economy where no productivity takes place at all. That's the banks, investments, funds, health insurance, property management, and such like. However, This sector contains the corporations and the people who fund election campaigns. And so they ensure economic conditions are created to suit them. Essentially, this sector is more powerful than any government, and they have been getting richer and richer and more powerful at exactly the same rate as us, the 99%ers, have gone backwards. So there is correlation there. Now let's get back to Luxon's idea that exporting dead animals and the byproducts extracted from them while they were alive and how they would play out in reality. So here it is, growing beef and lamb for Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Will New Zealanders get rich? So I put a list of points down here. Let's quickly go through them. The farming sector is highly automated, so employs very few people, but uses masses of our good quality land. What productivity does take place and the goods produced ultimately all go to the people in the UAE. Essentially, poor New Zealanders will be working for rich UAEans, if there's such a thing. No one except the farmer benefits from the profits, although some New Zealanders will receive a wage from being involved in the production of the goods and servicing the farmer's equipment, I suppose, but that's not really getting rich, that's earning a wage. Recent financial reports show that farmers have been faced with significant profitability challenges in recent years. So is it even profitable? Because New Zealand does not own its own shipping firms, exporters are at the mercy of major shipping cartels. So there's major risk in that. The banks, that's the fire sector, do take a cut for every UAE dirham exchanged for a New Zealand dollar. So they make a profit for doing no work. It's not productive at all. The New Zealand government taxes the profits from the farmers at 39% for the amounts over 180k. So it sounds like, yeah, well, somebody's making money. But as I said, if the government understood monetary operations, they would realise that taxing people and businesses does not provide government with currency to spend. And as we've seen, the New Zealand government is authorised to issue currency into the economy via its agents, the banks, at will. Again, taxes do not fund government spending in a fiat currency. That is unless, of course, you write stupid legislation and you're forced to do it. So here's the killer. In other words, they could have just typed the tax numbers that they extracted from the entire export-based farming process that Luxon is pushing straight into the Reserve Bank without anyone lifting a finger, except to press the buttons on the PC keyboard at the Reserve Bank. Are you starting to see the madness and potential fraud that we've been exposed to from our governments over recent decades? When you consider the type of economic illiteracy that they all suffer from, you begin to understand why we are in the economic mess that we're in and why there does not seem a pathway out of it. It's not likely that being slaves to overseas nations will improve our economy, and it will not make our family become better off. It is almost certain that anyone that is not employed in the fire sector will not get rich. With the realization that taxes don't fund government spending, what could we do instead to make New Zealand rich and improve our economy, make our lives better? So what could Luxon or any other government do if they understood government monetary operations? I'll put a list of a few things down here. They could remove coercive incomes tax and GST and replace it with a scaled property tax. This will free up the economy. People will have much more of them earned money in their hands. Apply a permanent zero interest rate. This is what will be used to control inflation. They have it round the wrong way. They increase interest rates thinking that they're defeating inflation. They've got the accelerator and the brake round the wrong way. They could introduce a well-paid transitional job guarantee to eliminate unemployment. They could increase the pension to match that transitional job guarantee so the pensioners can now contribute to the economy. They could consider a 7-year debt jubilee to eliminate predatory fire sector operations who keep us in permanent debt. This is a really good idea, and it was often done in ancient times, so we can talk more about that in the future. They could identify and prioritise the top 20 infrastructure projects in New Zealand. They could ensure that we have the labour and materials to provide it, because that's what limits spending, not money. So it's the resources, it's the materials and labour that you have is the limiting factor, not money. They could call for tenders and issue contracts to design the infrastructure from New Zealand-based companies. They don't need overseas companies to do it. They could call for tenders and issue the contracts to build the infrastructure from New Zealand-based companies. Again, they don't need to go to big corporations overseas to build our infrastructure. They could ensure that there is a continuous pipeline of important infrastructure projects to eliminate political party influence. And they could take back government control of all essential services to again eliminate predatory corporations ripping Kiwis off. Now, I can't see Luxon or any other current political party doing any of those things that are required to kickstart an economy that would benefit us, the 99%ers, and not the 1%ers in the fire sector. However, there is an option just arriving on the landscape. A political party with just those economic insights, along with an online subscription-based learning platform. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, if a political party states that it's going to remove all references to the Treaty of Waitangi from the government policies and eliminate all race-based policies, create a constitution that limits government power over the people, it will be difficult to gain mainstream attention. If they then include in that constitution many of the tax relief and debt cancellation initiatives I've introduced above as rights, not policies, now every other political party will try to take it down. So it will rely on you, the people, to support these new initiatives. The Unite New Zealand Party, led by Lee Taitua, is advocating for all of these things and more. So you'll have to check them out. Just type the URL above into your browser and learn an exciting new way to move forward as a nation. Moreover, for those who doubt this economic reform, there is a new online education platform called Community Health New Zealand. One of the many learning modules on how to operate an economy on that platform is a free module that teaches the principles of fiat currency economics that we currently operate. The whole module, which is about 7 minutes long, is on the next slide. Please take the time to understand how the current monetary system should operate if they repealed the stupid legislation they're concentrating on. So as I wrap up this episode of Andy Oakley Investigates, I hope I have shown that in the fiat currency country that we operate in, growing food and selling it to rich nations does not make our economy rich or our families better off, as Luxon stated. Instead, it is investing in our country's infrastructure and creating the economic conditions here in New Zealand where humans can flourish. That's what's important for economic growth. In fact, selling to ourselves will accomplish that. In the meantime, I've been Andy Oakley, and this was Andy Oakley Investigates. And don't forget the free learning module in the next slide.
Kia ora nau mai haere mai, and welcome back to the Pātaka Institute. My name is Tingahuru Taituha, Community Health CEO and your Kiwi Economics Facilitator for today. We will walk through one of the most important insights into our monetary system, the New Zealand government monetary system today. If you remember one thing from today, let it be this 3-step sequence. It explains how the New Zealand monetary system actually works, and it sets the foundation for understanding everything else in economics. So following this lesson, please review the 3-step sequence over and over again until it becomes clear and familiar as possible. This is crucially important to understand all other Kiwi economics insights. Step 1. The tax liability. The sequence begins with our desire to organise a government to enforce laws and property rights on our behalf and facilitate a productive economy in order for us to all enjoy an ever-increasing standard of living. This begins with the government imposing a tax liability payable only in the government currency, New Zealand dollars. The tax liability must be coercive with penalties for non-payment. So, in order to pay the government liability, the citizens and legal residents of New Zealand, like you and me, become sellers of goods and services in exchange for New Zealand dollars needed to pay the government tax liability. For example, someone might grow cabbages while another person might fix cars. Both are trying to earn New Zealand dollars. Step 2. The issuance of New Zealand dollars by the government via its agents, the banks. The government issues New Zealand dollars via its regulated and supervised agents, the banks, by spending to purchase the goods and services in order to provision the government with the goods and services for public purposes, e.g., tradespeople and builders to build hospitals, police officers, nurses, and teachers' salaries, etc. These dollars then flow into the economy and into the hands of people like you and me. Step 3. The payment of taxes. Once the government issues New Zealand dollars, we can then earn them by selling our goods and services. We then use those dollars to pay our taxes. The payment of taxes is a simple transaction where the balance in your account is typed down and the balance in your IRD account is credited, then returned to zero. The dollars used to pay taxes are not recycled. The balance is simply returned to zero, showing your taxes have been paid. The ultimate outcome is the creation of new goods and services you produced, not a balance of dollars in the government side of the electronic spreadsheet. The purpose of taxation is to create sellers of new goods and services, not to enable the government to be able to issue New Zealand dollars in the first place. Government is able to issue/spend New Zealand dollars independently of receiving tax payments. Again, the purpose of the tax liability is to create sellers of goods and services like myself and you. An important note, these insights that I'm teaching you right now are not policy proposals, but the most accurate description of the actual monetary sequence in use today by New Zealand and other governments whom operate floating exchange rate currencies like the New Zealand dollar. Let's revisit this in 2 real-world examples. Imagine Emma, a cafe owner of a private business. The government imposes a tax liability on Emma, for instance, income tax and GST. To meet this, Emma starts selling coffee and pastries. Her customers pay in New Zealand dollars, dollars that originally came from the government or through our banks. Once Emma earns enough, she uses those dollars to pay her expenses and savings desires. But these are purely discretionary uses of New Zealand dollars. Emma must at some point pay her mandatory government tax liability. The result? The creation of new goods and services contributing to a productive economy and raising living standards. Our second example. Take James. James is a police officer, a government employee. The government imposes a tax liability on James, for instance, income tax. To meet this, James turns up to work and carries out his services and duties as a police officer. James is paid every fortnight his salary in New Zealand dollars by the government. James's income tax is automatically deducted from his fortnightly salary payment. James is then free to spend the rest of his salary on his discretionary spending. The result? The creation of new services contributing to a productive economy and raising the standard of living. To recap, the correct monetary sequence in use today by the New Zealand government. 1. The government sets a tax liability payable only in New Zealand dollars. The government then issues New Zealand dollars to pay for the goods and services via its agents, like the banks. And third, only then can taxes be paid. This sequence is simple but often misunderstood. Taxes don't fund government spending. Government spending creates the very dollars we need to pay taxes. Government must issue the New Zealand dollars first, otherwise they don't exist. In conclusion, to recap, we use our existing monetary system with the levying of a coercive tax liability as step one to enable our economy to operate. The purpose of taxation is the creation of new goods and services that raise our standard of living. A tax liability is therefore crucial to enable this to occur. Thank you for joining me today, and let's continue to build a smarter, healthier, and more united New Zealand.